Hi everyone, this is Moo. I think I'm going to start a series on the 10 most common character flaws. According to Dr. Louis Tartaglia, and Dr. Louis Tartaglia is an author, a psychiatrist, an addiction medicine specialist, and the director of the Tartaglia Technologies Institute, an organization whose mission is to create new insights for individuals, increase personal and professional productivity, dramatically enhance character, self-esteem, and discover life's preeminent purpose. So the 10 most common character flaws are 1. Addicted to being right, 2. Raging indignation, 3. Fixing blame and nurturing resentments, 4. The dread seekers, worry and fear, 5. Intolerance, 6. The poor me or martyr syndrome, 7. Self-regard run riot, which in this case I believe he's speaking about narcissism without using the word. So it's self-regard run riot. Number 8, the excuse for everything, inadequacy. Number 9, hypercritical fault finders. Number 10, chronic dishonesty, the trap. So Tartaglia says that this book that we're going to be taking these character flaws and explanations from is about hope. He says you already have everything you need to get going. If you've identified one of the character flaws as your own, don't focus too hard on it. He says to start exploring the wholesome quality that could replace it and make your life better. And that you don't have to really read the chapters in order. So I'm going to be jumping around, and I'm probably not going to read word for word, although maybe parts of it I will. And by the way, being human means having flaws. Everybody has flaws. We all have flaws. That's just part of the human experience. Dr. Tartaglia says a real sign of maturity is the ability to laugh at yourself. He says, I hope you take yourself a little less seriously after going over these common character flaws. Recreating yourself, changing your destiny is serious, but criticism from others really isn't. When you start to change, I guarantee that some well-meaning friend or relative will try to get you to be your old self. Isn't that true? Yeah, that's absolutely true. They will get a bit uncomfortable with the changes they see. They're used to your goofy behavior and would like to see it continue. If they're offering you criticism out of love and not the need to be right, then accept it if it is true and be amused by it if it isn't. Remember that the goal of transformation is profound peace and loving relationships. You don't need all this aggravation just to fulfill the need to be right or to be admired. Life is a gift to you. Your life can be a blessing to others. Your character is the wrapping that the gifts of your soul are packaged in. Make it a work of art. The world will be a better place if you do. So with that said, today I'm going to focus on character flaw, raging indignation. How do you know if you have raging indignation? Do you get angry even when it would be wiser to stay in control? Does arguing feel more normal than discussion? Do you use your rage to control or intimidate others? Do you sometimes stop and wonder, how did I get so upset? Are others put off or frightened by your anger? Does anger feel like a rush, almost thrilling? Do you think a good argument is a lot of fun? Do you get outraged in public and embarrass your friends and family? Do you argue with strangers? Do you berate employees or even your boss from time to time? Do people frequently ask you to calm down? Do you use the excuse that, quote, I'm Irish or Italian or German or some other ethnicity for being upset? Is being upset your only emotion? Do people say, he's a nice guy, but don't get him upset about you? Do you feel better about yourself when you are enraged? Are you known for your short fuse? Do you like to stoke other people's rage? Do you sometimes look for an excuse to be upset? Do you make a villain out of certain people so you can vent your anger and be justified? So if some of you guys are like me, you have had the unfortunate experience of either knowing or being in a relationship, maybe having a family member or a parent or somebody else in your life that is or was a raging indignant. It's a really difficult situation to be in. My personal story with raging indignant, well, I grew up with one. My father was one, had rage issues, was also a narcissist. And then years later, I found myself in a relationship and living with someone who was quite abusive. It escalated over time. It didn't start out that way. During the honeymoon phase and the reeling in that the narcissist abuser always does. And so I found myself in a situation a couple of years later with a raging indignant who I believe was also a psychopath. But I believe he was a psychopath and quite abusive. So the abuse escalated over time, as I said. So at first it was very, very, very subtle. Because I'm very sensitive to that, being like empathic, I felt it in my gut, like in my solar plexus. If something was said or he did something, and I knew it didn't feel right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Like what is this? Like that didn't feel good or that didn't feel right. And then over time, it gradually evolved more and more and escalated more and more from that little, like something that he just said did not feel right? And then it escalated and escalated to then more overt verbal abuse. And then it escalated to more overt, doing things to me, not yet hitting me though. That was at the very end. And so it escalated into horrible things, and that maybe I will do a separate video on. But one of the big things I noticed was the raging indignation, and I knew it didn't have anything to do with me because it was so sudden and so over the top. We could just be having a normal conversation, and I could tell he's looking for something to give him an excuse to fly into a rage for no reason, and then afterwards say, well, if you hadn't have done, or if you hadn't have said this, I wouldn't have, fill in the blank. So that's very common, and that's raging indignation. And anger in general can be like a drug for some people. So it is just like a drug for some people. They need that anger to feel alive. Whether it's because they're depressed and they feel so dead inside that they need to create drama. And one of the ways to do that is anger. A quote from Proverbs 14:29 says, "He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit exalts folly." So going back a little bit to where I said that anger was like a drug for some people, Tartaglia says anger becomes a character flaw when it's used like a drug for the rush. When you hear someone with this flaw, he usually is worked up about nothing. It really amounts to raging bull. It's inflicted on others to feed one's own ego. The raging indignation makes the person feel revved up and alive. He or she is addicted to excitement. Sometimes it's a passive individual who is frustrated by not being able to manipulate someone. He says sometimes you'll run into people who want to drop bombs on you and not expect anything in return. At least that's the way they act. They insult you and get really annoyed, irritable, or hostile. They hope that by showing you their irritability, you will back off and leave them alone. The usual scenario, though, is a slow intensification of emotions. We all have a boiling point or a flash point. With people who are consumed by the fires of raging indignation, the flash point comes much faster. The boiling point is lower. Tolerance is not nearly as great. The raging indignant has a much more abrupt way of dealing with annoyance. They go right to violence. They cut to the chase and short-circuit everything. They also justify why it's okay to get so out of control. Then they go ballistic. According to Tartaglia, he says raging indignation is a character flaw that has many variations. So he shows two charts. One is called simmer to scorch, which would be annoyance, frustration, irritability, anger, and then indignation. And on the other chart, raging indignation, it's annoyance, reaction, raging indignation. Tartaglia says, it doesn't take anyone to get you mad. If you already planned on being upset, then it doesn't matter who gets in your way. The raging indignant plans to be upset, actually longs for it. It makes them feel alive, whole, and powerful. Often they seek out the weak because they know it's safer to go ballistic on someone who is defenseless. Others are just convenient targets for the abuse. Being a target of someone else's rage is not pleasant. Worse yet, the raging indignant tried to convince you it was not premeditated. Often people with this flaw tend to lump all their emotions into one category. They don't have the ability to sort through and distinguish between annoyance, frustration, irritation, and anger. They're just upset. From upset, they go to raging indignation. Don't argue with them about it either. They can't tell the difference. We all have fuses. We have to learn how to make them longer. Rageaholics hate to let anything cool off. Staying heated and intense is a way for them to feel normal. Worse yet, they hate to wait for a long fuse to burn. The explosion is the thing that makes them feel alive. A raging person is different from someone who occasionally blows off steam out of frustration, anger, or bitterness. Raging indignation is never pent up. It is the continuous use of explosive anger to deal with everyday situations. It is blowing a fuse way before anyone else does. It comes from learning that anger and rage are a solution. Most often, the raging indignant have been abused as children and had role models that blew their tops often and for no good reason. Short fuses, hair triggers, and the lure of violent reaction. Most of us kindle before we burn. We all have a point at which the fire burns on its own. Most of us also have buttons that can be pushed to stoke us on and increase the heat. Our friends and family know what our buttons are. It's inevitable. If you live with someone long enough, he or she will learn how to push your buttons. But they are your buttons. It is your responsibility to disconnect them when they are causing problems. So going back to how a raging indignant uses their indignance and anger or their rage the way a drug addict uses a drug. So in my experience living with a raging indignant, it was like a pattern of behavior, kind of like a cycle of a pattern of behavior. So it would happen every, I'm just going to generalize and say maybe every 3 months. And I could, over time, eventually figure out when it was going to happen and when he was actually looking for any little reason or no reason at all to explode and go into a rage. So they use it as a drug addict uses a drug. They want to be revved up and feel normal. So they may actually feel calmer after going ballistic. And Tartaglia says they love the excitement and the danger. They feel in control, but they don't want you to understand their secrets. Now, what are their secrets about the raging indignation? So Tartaglia says the secrets of the raging indignant, they know that they are unbalanced. A button has been pushed and they hurt. They feel weak. Old issues or patterns aren't dead and are still causing problems. They feel as ugly as they are acting. They fear that you might be better than them. Indeed, that is a truth. So they know that they are unbalanced. You may call them wacky or off their rocker, call them anything you want. As soon as you let them know that you think that they are out of control or out of balance, you've taken some of their power away. Be careful. They may get angrier because you know this secret. They struggle desperately to pretend they are normal. A button has been pushed and they are hurt. They're using their anger to medicate that ache within them. Even a little reaction to a small problem can escalate or develop into a raging pattern of behavior. They feel weak. They're using their anger to express a lack of strength, or worse yet, to reveal a place where strength is desperately needed. Old issues or patterns aren't dead and are still causing problems. The roots may be unconscious patterns, the substance of which is complicated and interconnected with other issues from childhood. They feel as ugly as they are acting. The most frequent positive comment I've had from patients with disfiguring burns is that at least their scars were on the outside and could be dealt with up front. The raging indignant use anger to cover their emotional scars. They fear that you might be better than they are. What they say to themselves is different, though. Quote, "If I am better than others, it is my right to abuse them," end quote. Then, with twisted logic, they say, quote, "If I have been able to abuse you, then I must be better than you," end quote. This is classically the bitter fruit of child abuse. So, what to do with indignation when you encounter it in others? Tartaglia says, create a safety zone. Don't bother to argue with insanity. Confront the behavior firmly. Look for the secret or fear. Set up a timeout cue if they are willing, which in my experience, they never would be willing. Make sure they suffer the consequences. Remove yourself as a target. Remove yourself as a target, and in a lot of cases that means going no contact or physically removing yourself from the situation, the relationship, the environment. Tartaglia writes, when a person is in raging indignation, you are not safe unless you are out of the zone of danger. That's more than just a boundary, it's a zone. Sometimes it's physical, sometimes it is an emotional zone. Some of my patients did much better when they went away to school. They had to go very far away to be safe. If the rageaholic is prone to physical abuse, it may mean leaving the premises. It may mean seeking shelter, but it always means getting far away that you won't get hurt. Don't bother to argue with insanity, right? It's impossible to reason with insanity, so it's pretty much impossible to argue with insanity. Tartaglia says you can't reason with it, nor can you share your feelings, and that's a big one, because empaths and others who are in the sights or the targets of the raging indignation may try to share our feelings, right? So you can't share your feelings. Insanity is an equal opportunity destroyer. Whoever gets in its way is due for trouble. Confront angry behavior firmly. You should confront the behavior and not the person. It is ethical to oppose the raging indignant and to confront the stoker. Do so with a certain amount of coolness and restraint. You're trying to care for yourself first, not fix them. The raging indignant hate to be told that they are out of control. They resent the fact that you can see through their behavior. That's the last thing that they want to hear. Point out what is wrong with the behavior, not them. Next is to look for the secret. You need to know it in order to be more effective with the raging indignant. Because remember that most raging indignants, they really feel weak and vulnerable, maybe scared, insecure. That's what's underneath it. So Tartaglia suggests setting a timeout, if they'll go for something like that, which is, again, in my experience, no way. But maybe with children it might work. It's a device that you can use for little children, and it works well here, he says. He says that's probably because the rageaholic has regressed to around 6 years of age emotionally. Maybe that's why so many rageaholics find women who can nurture and mother them. That's insightful. Maybe that's why so many rageaholics find women who can nurture and mother them. A temper tantrum in a grown-up is far more dangerous than one in a child. If you've developed a plan to deal with the raging indignant, make sure he or she suffers consequences. He says there is no change with this character defect without some suffering. And, for example, if you're going to say something like, the next time you hit me or whatever, I'm leaving, or I'm, filing for divorce or whatever, he says you have to be ready to carry it out, because idle threats serve to inflame the raging indignant's appetite for violence. And that's true, and you'll hear it if you know anything about domestic violence. You have to be really careful, and you have to have a plan in place if you are going to leave an abuser or a raging indignant or a sociopath or a psychopath. You have to have a plan, and it's good to contact your local domestic violence agency, or one that's in your area, and they will help you with a safe exit strategy and plan. And Tartaglia goes on to say, if all else fails, completely remove yourself as a target. Sometimes the only intelligent thing to do is to get out of the range of the rage. Shelter yourself from its sphere of influence. And finally, let's talk about how to rid yourself of the character flaw if, and that's a big if, someone who recognizes this character flaw in themselves, raging indignance, and the underlying stuff. These are Dr. Tartaglia's suggestions of how to rid yourself of the character flaw of raging indignance. Exhale slowly, do a deathbed contrast, see the anger as chains, empty the garbage, focus on what you love. And in more detail, he goes into each category. So exhale slowly. A patient of Dr. Tartaglia's had said, he suggested that it was the first step to calming down, is to exhale slowly, because he had noticed that while watching guys fight, that the more violent they were going to be, the deeper they breathed and the faster they blew it out. So Dr. Tartaglia agreed with him. Taking a slow, middle-sized breath into your belly and slowly exhaling shuts down some of the fight-or-flight reaction. It interrupts it. That same patient had told Dr. Tartaglia about, and this is going back to do a deathbed contrast. He had told the doctor he had been at his grandfather's bedside when he died, and he couldn't understand why his grandfather had forgiven a man who had come to see him. He remembered his grandfather saying, "From here, at the end of my life, the whole stupid situation doesn't seem so big." The next step, see the anger that persisted as chains, binding his power and sapping his strength. The picture in his mind was that of Samson in the temple. And this is the patient that was talking to Dr. Tartaglia. He believed that real strength comes from God. If he gave himself some time for his hair to grow, he could use the chains rather than be bound by them. The chains that anger represents are anchored to strong needs. So he decided that when he found himself bound by the chains, he would look to see what secret would unlock the chains. The next step, empty the garbage. If your garbage isn't disposed of regularly, your whole neighborhood begins to stink. So the last step of the patient surprised the doctor, which was focus on what you love. There was a guy who was afraid I was going to try to convince him that he had to be sweet and gentle, talking to me about a focus on love. The most remarkable thing, says Dr. Tartaglia, that happens to a person who gives up the right to raging indignation is that he finds profound peace. It's associated with enormous power and restrained passion, and that's a huge thing. It's a seeming paradox that I was talking of before in some other videos. But I'll read it again. The most remarkable thing that happens to a person who gives up the right to raging indignation is that he finds profound peace. It's associated with enormous power and restrained passion. So going back to the book, he says, a sense of capability and competence takes over. If you don't give up the right to raging indignation, you get stuck in vengeance. And on that note, that was one of the 10 most common character flaws, raging indignation. So if you've heard anything here that maybe you recognize as a character flaw in yourself, or maybe somebody else in your relationship, sphere of relationships, I should say. So it could be anybody really that you are in a relationship with of any kind. Then I really hope this has been helpful in some way. And it's never too late to change. Get better. Make the world a better place. Find peace within yourself. And until I meet you next time, take care, and I really thank you for your time and attention. And also, if you actually do have or recognize this character flaw in yourself or in someone else in your life or that was in your life, feel free to leave a comment. Share with us. Let us know your take on it or your experience with it. And share it with others. Share it with us. Sometimes it's good to talk about it, right?